Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com, and we have another hand today from a $3,000 buy-in World Series of Poker event. Here I raised to $550 from second position with pocket kings. We are playing about 100 big blinds deep at 100-200 with a 25 ante, and I think this raise is perfectly fine. And we get called by the player in third position, and then also the player on the button, and the small blind, and the big blind. Now, before the flop even comes out, a lot of people like to think, oh my gosh, I have kings and I raised and I got 4 callers. Kings are just ace magnets and now I lose. And that is not the mindset you need to have. You have to realize that most of the time when the flop is bad for you and you actually have the worst hand, it's pretty obvious. Like when it comes ace 7-3 and you're against 4 opponents, you know you probably don't have the best hand, especially if any money goes in the pot. If it comes 9-8-7 with 3 diamonds and you have the king of clubs, king of spades, you know you probably don't have the best hand and you're not trying to play a big pot. So in those scenarios, yeah, you're just going to lose, and that's okay. And you don't need to lose much at all, maybe 1 bet at most. If it comes where you have an overpair, very often you just have the best hand and you're going to take your opponents for a ride. And sometimes when it does come somewhat dry, like 9-7-2, and you bet and your opponent raises, that's the only time you're actually in a difficult spot, because that's the only time you're actually beat, right? And sometimes you're beat on the 9-7-2 and you get check raised, and sometimes you're not, and it does depend how your opponents play, if you should fold or not. But in general, you're going to end up losing a medium-sized pot in those scenarios. So either you have the best hand, which is going to be the case most of the time, or you're obviously beat, in which case you lose almost nothing, or you run into one of those spots where you do have reverse implied odds, you have a good overpair on a dry board, and you're going to lose 30 or 40 or 50 big blinds, and that's okay. Don't think, though, that you just lose every time you raise and you get a bunch of callers. That's just not how poker works. So, we're very happy to play this pot, regardless of how many opponents we're against. And this time, it comes ace-king-10, giving us a set. We only lose to queen jack. Now, it is important to note that all of our opponents probably have more queen jacks than I do, because I'm not raising queen jack offsuit from this seat. Yet, a lot of people will call with queen jack offsuit. Everyone besides the player in third position could probably have up to, well, full 16 combinations. Whereas I only have 4, but I'm going to have way more aces and kings and ace-king than our opponents. So, I have a pretty strong range, and so I'm going to bet. I do bet 1,300 into the 3,000 pot. I wish I would have bet a little bit bigger here, mainly because if someone has an ace, they're pretty much never going to fold. And if they have a king or a 10 with a queen or a jack, they're also never going to fold. So I think a slightly larger bet would have extracted more value and would also allow us to make a bigger turn bet. So I would have preferred about 1,700 on the flop. But I do bet 1,300. Everyone folds back around to the player in the big blind who calls. So when he calls, I'm loving my hand. I'm not expecting I'm beat very often. I think most people would check raise if they have queen jack on this flop, but it is important to realize that really, are there very many bluffs your opponent can come up with on ace king 10? Because on ace king 10, that should be so good for me that my opponent really should not be check raising very often at all. So if my opponent's playing well, I actually think he should look to check the flop and look to check call, and then check call the turn, because similarly, the turn's also going to be very good for the pre-flop raiser most of the time. And then on the river, he should probably check the river. So I could be against queen jack whenever I bet all 3 streets, but that said, I could also be against an ace or ace 10 or king 10 or ace X or king X, a lot of stuff, right? So I'm just going to go for value. The turn's a 4 of clubs, a complete blank. It does put up a backdoor flush draw. I'm just going to bet, though. This time I bet 2,800, and I'm fine with this bet. It is important to realize that when you bet smaller on the flop, as I did in this spot, it allows your opponent to get to the turn with a slightly weaker range compared to if you bet bigger on the flop. Therefore, your opponent's range when you get to the turn is going to be weaker. So if your opponent's range is weaker, how do you extract value from the weaker range? Well, you bet a little bit smaller. So that is what I do. In this scenario, I bet 2,800 into the 5,500 pot. If I bet a little bit bigger on the flop, that would have made our opponent's range stronger going to the turn, in which case I could have bet a little bit bigger on the turn. And notice that's just a good thing because we're building a bigger pot with our hand that's likely best. But here we are. This is what we've done. I do bet 2,800, and the opponent calls. And the only river I don't want to see now is a queen or a jack. Those are the only bad rivers. This time the river's the 9 of clubs, which does put up the backdoor flush draw, but besides that, we still have the effective nuts. My opponent checks, and I go for a 3,800 bet. At this point, I'm just trying to get called by mostly ace-x. If our opponent did happen to turn or river 2-pair, he's definitely going to call. If he flopped 2-pair with king 10, he's going to call. If he somehow had king 9, he's going to call, although again, those are all very unlikely because I have 2 kings in my hand. But I definitely think there is value in betting. I lose to only queen jack. And who knows, maybe our opponent decides to hero call us for no reason at all. This time, though, much to my surprise, actually, the opponent check raises all in. And as I alluded to earlier, our opponent actually should strongly consider checking the flop with queen jack and then check call. Check the turn with queen jack because I should keep betting a lot on this turn. And then check the river because I should keep betting the river, exactly as I did with my pocket kings, right? So I think a lot of people find themselves in this scenario and they ask themselves, could I be beat? And the answer is, yeah, obviously you could be beat. But that doesn't mean you are beat every time. What you want to look at here is you want to take a look and see that you need to call about 11,000 into a pot that's going to be about 40, we'll call it 42,000. So are we good here about 20% of the time? And clearly, our opponent has done a great job of taking our hand and turning it into a bluff catcher. And we have almost the nuts, right? Anytime your opponent can make almost the nuts become a bluff catcher, that's usually a pretty sweet line. And that's what happens very often if your opponent does raise or check raise the river. So which hands would our opponent value raise with that are worse than ours? If our opponent had a set of 10s, would he take this line? I mean, he probably shouldn't because I could just have aces or kings or queen jack suited, right? If he had ace king or ace 10, would he do this? Again, probably not because I could have those better hands. So everything else just beyond that must be a bluff if he's check raising. Would he ever check raise king, queen, queen 10, or jack 10 as a bluff on the river? I mean, those are hands that make sense to check raise because they have a blocker, but that doesn't mean everyone will. Would he ever check raise pocket jacks on the river if he decided to just call it pre-flop? Maybe he would. As you can see, though, I'm kind of stretching to find anything that can realistically be bluffing in this spot. Also, our opponent could just have a backdoor flush with something like king, queen of clubs. Or I guess not king, queen of clubs, because I have the king of clubs. He could have queen, 10 of clubs or something like that backdoor to flush, which is a little bit unfortunate as well. So we do lose to maybe a few combinations of the queens of clubs, maybe some jack of clubs, maybe some 10 of clubs. So this is a dicey spot. That said, if you all know anything about my play, I don't like folding very often, and we have a set. So what I typically look at here is I want to ask myself, what are the best hands in my range? And queen jack suited, there's 4 of those. Aces, there's 3 of those. And kings, there's 3 of those. So right there, it's only 10 combinations of hands. That's not very many combinations of hands at all. There are 9 combinations of ace-king. So right off the bat, if I'm folding the ace-king and everything else worse than that, like ace-10, if I had that hand as well, notice I'm already folding a lot of hands in proportion to the hands I'm calling with. So for that reason, I think I just have to call. Our hand's too good. Sometimes your hand's too good, and you have to keep your opponent honest. I do expect to lose here a lot, probably about, I don't even know, half the time or more, but I only need to be good about 20% of the time. So I do call. And my opponent shows up with a hand that I never really expected him to show up with, ace-10. Maybe he was running a bluff with this hand, thinking that, I don't even know what he's thinking, really. Maybe he's blocking aces and 10s, therefore it's a nice bluffing hand because the only hand I can really call with now is pocket kings and queen jack suited. So that takes us down to 4 queen jack suiteds, 3 kings, and then 1 aces and 1 10s. Even then, that's not that big of a deal. So kind of a cool spot. I don't know what our opponent was doing. I think he has a pretty easy check call on the flop, check call on the turn, and then maybe even a check fold on the river. Or at least a check call. I'm not a really big fan of raising in these spots. That said, I definitely think I do not check raise the river as often as I should as a bluff. The problem, though, is here, what's our opponent trying to make us fold? He's trying to make us fold ace, king, or better. Don't try to make a calling station fold ace, king, or better. It's not going to work out too well for you. That's going to be it for this hand for PokerNews.com. I want to thank all of you for being here. If you enjoyed this, definitely check out my training site over at PokerCoaching.com. There I have a lot of interactive hands just like this where we go a little bit more in depth and discuss exactly how these ranges break down and how you should be playing these scenarios. It's completely free to sign up for a 1-week trial, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. Thanks a lot, and I'll be back here next week with another hand for PokerNews.com.